The latest from China this morning is that there is still some resistance, some violence in the army's effort to crush the democracy movement there. And now we're going to talk with two familiar and experienced China watchers. In San Francisco, writer-journalist Orville Schell, and in New York, Richard Holbrooke, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Asian Affairs in the Carter administration. Mr. Schell, let's start with you. We've heard what's been happening and continues to happen in Beijing. Over the years, we've been familiar with a rhythm of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in China. How many steps backward has the country gone now?
Well, I think in effect what the government has done is cashier itself. I can't imagine how the regime of Deng Xiaoping can continue. And we're not talking about here a revolution in a traditional sense of, you know, one class against another. What we see here is a revolution where the people are against a very small minority in the government. And this is a situation which, I mean, the basic glue between the top and the bottom has now been broken in, I think, an irrevocable way. And I seriously doubt that this government can rule effectively from here on in.
Well, what does that mean in terms of the open door closing, totally or at least part way, the door between China and the rest of the world, and the United States in specific?
Well, I think it's impossible to close the door now. I mean, I think economically speaking, China has joined the world market system, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of students here. I think that is no longer thinkable in the Maoist sense of China retreating into isolation. And I think this only makes the regime's ability to rule even more difficult. Because now there are leaks at every quarter, there are foreign television, radio there, the eyes of the world are upon it, and the eyes of the world have seen what their technique is in terms of dealing with dissent. And by and large, it's not been a very pretty picture.
Richard Holbrooke in New York, is there anything to be salvaged from this as far as China is concerned, or the United States?
At this point, Garrick, I can't see the slightest positive aspects of this. In the long run, of course, it's shown that the reform movement in China, the Chinese people's desire for progress and modernization, not only economically, which they were getting, but politically, is unstoppable. But in the short run, it's a tragedy of almost indescribable dimensions.
Mr. Holbrooke, if you were George Bush in this administration, what would you be doing? Sanctions or not?
I would agree with Senator Lugar's statements in your previous section in every aspect. I would not fault the administration, and I would merely add, in reference to the previous question, that the United States cannot affect what the Chinese leadership does inside China. It's a harsh truth, but these are tough, ruthless communist leaders. Over the last 60 years, they fought for their country. They fought a civil war. They killed many people, and when they felt they were threatened, they used the kind of methodology they'd used before to reestablish order. We cannot affect that situation, but we must deal with the implications of it for our own national interest.
And Mr. Schell, you talked about the leadership now not being able to survive. What will happen? What has happened to Zhao Ziyang, for instance? Is he under house arrest? Who will emerge?
Well, I think this is a very dangerous situation. We don't really know what's happened to Zhao. I mean, he's plausibly and logically the person who could form some kind of an interim government. And I would actually fear for his life at this point. I think Deng Xiaoping and people on his side must look at Zhao with great circumspection and a good deal of fear. I would just perhaps add a footnote to what Dick Holbrooke said. I actually think the Bush administration has been rather remiss in their not taking a much firmer stand a lot earlier. I mean, one has to imagine what the posture of the United States would have been if there had been 100,000 people demonstrating for democracy in Nicaragua. To say that we cannot have any effect on the internal situation in China, I think is not true. I think we could have had some effect by putting them on notice early on, before all this happened, that this is simply not the kind of behavior that the United States countenances. And indeed,
Garrett,
we have not done so elsewhere in the world.
Garrett,
Dick, go ahead.
I just footnote that, in fact, President Bush's statements on this have been stronger than the administration's positions on the Soviet repression in Georgia. I don't want to get into a comparative argument here, but the administration has a very difficult problem on its hands. We have our strategic interests to consider. There is no question in my mind that every Chinese understands where American sympathies lie in this situation.
John?
Dick, let me ask you this. It's clear that Congress is about to move to do something to cut off military aid to China. Should the administration join this move or resist it?
That's an incredibly tough question for me to answer today, John, but I would say that we cannot remain idle in the face of what's happened, there will be repercussions. In regard to the area you're talking about, it has to be divided into two aspects. A lot of the military cooperation was very much to America's strategic benefit, and if it were cut off, the major beneficiary would be the Soviet Union. On the other hand, I quite agree with Senator Helms and Congressman Solars to the extent that American military assistance cannot be involved in the repression. The issues you're raising must be addressed at the highest levels. I don't think they have a clear answer at this point.
Orville Schell, let's go back to you. We've been talking about policy, what should be done. Let's talk about the personal situation on the ground in China. You know the country very well. You were there quite recently. Assuming that the student movement has now been crushed, what happens? What do these students do? How does the ferment, if any, continue in China?
Well, Garrick, I think the tragedy is that the student movement, in fact, has not been crushed. I think you may see a lull here for a few days. People are absolutely stunned, shocked. I mean, they couldn't believe that the government finally could have done this. And I think what you're going to see is either a national strike, which will paralyze the country, destroy the economy, or I think you're going to see a turning underground of the forces of dissent, which have now been up to date, been peaceful, and been above board, and one of the most remarkable nonviolent demonstrations in this century. And I think people will now begin to indulge in acts of underground organizing, very much as the Communist Party did when it came to power, possibly even sabotage and terrorism. And already I hear friends talking about this, about weapons factories in the Peking area, leaking weapons to students, about people taking to the streets sub rosa. And I think this would be quite logical, this sort of rage and frustration acting itself out in a underground fashion.
I would add that I don't think that the power struggle inside the Politburo and the Central Committee is at all necessarily over. The hardliners won only because Deng Xiaoping was still alive and able to use all the prestige and authority he'd accumulated over 60 years.
Richard Holbrooke.
Once Deng leaves the scene, I would guess that the reformers, backed by this pressure Orville has just mentioned, will ultimately triumph, but in a tragic, brutal, and difficult way.
Richard Holbrooke in New York, Orville Schell in San Francisco, thank you very much for being with us this morning here on Meet the Press. My thanks also to Andrea Mitchell and John Dancy. Mao Zedong said it, and it is often repeated. Power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Today, Mao's political heirs in Beijing are still trying to prove it. But of all the distant observers of what is happening in China, none should be more concerned than Mikhail Gorbachev.